Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to uncover a genuinely surprising and kind of hidden chapter in the life of America's most famous naturalist. When you hear the name John Muir, you probably immediately think of California's Sierra Nevada mountains, right? Yosemite, the giant redwoods, maybe Alaskan glaciers. But in 1903, at the age of 65, Muir embarked on a grand world tour. And rather than just heading straight back home across the Pacific, he took a fascinating detour. He literally traded the familiar pines of the Sierras for the tropical flora of British India. Today, we're going to retrace his incredible, entirely unplanned botanical pilgrimage across the subcontinent. Here is Muir's botanical itinerary for this trip. First, we'll look at the unplanned nature of his pilgrimage. Then, we'll check out Calcutta's Great Banyan tree. Third, we'll experience the divine light in the Himalayas. Fourth, we'll explore Simla's sacred Deodar forests. And finally, number 5, the Banyans of Bombay. All right, let's jump right into Section 1, an unplanned botanical pilgrimage. It's really wild to think about the sheer vastness of the geography Muir covered on this trip, especially considering he hadn't originally planned to visit India at all. But once he got there, he was all in. He relentlessly navigated this massive country using trains, boats, horse-drawn carriages, and just good old-fashioned shoe leather. And the most interesting part? While the typical tourists of the time were totally focused on historic, man-made monuments, Muir couldn't have cared less. He dedicated his time almost entirely to hunting down exotic plants, great mountains, and completely untouched natural spaces. For the first half of this adventure, he traveled with a guy named Dr. William Lord Smith. And talk about an odd couple. You had Dr. Smith, who was a big game hunter, actively trying to collect large cats for natural history museums back in New York and New England. And right beside him is John Muir, a staunch preservationist relentlessly hunting for botanical wonders, glaciers, and mountain peaks. Just two completely different philosophies of nature sharing the exact same itinerary. Moving on to Section 2, Calcutta's Great Banyan tree. This brings us to a pilgrimage Muir had actually been waiting to make since he was a young boy. He arrived in Calcutta after dark on September 29th, coming off the steamer Bengala out of Rangoon. Now, Calcutta was the seat of the British imperial government, so it was packed with these magnificent buildings. Muir naturally ignored all of them. His botanical enthusiasm was just so sky-high that the very next morning, he literally skipped breakfast so he could rush straight to the Royal Botanic Garden, which was 5 or 6 miles away through the suburbs. So why the huge rush? Well, he was absolutely desperate to see the Great Banyan. The banyan is this magnificent tree species with a really remarkable growth habit. It sends down these aerial roots from its branches that grow straight down to the ground, eventually taking on the appearance of entirely new trunks. The end result is a single tree that looks exactly like a small forest. Muir actually had an engraving of a banyan in a book back in his personal library at home, and he'd been dreaming of seeing one in person for decades. He'd first learned about it reading John Milton's Paradise Lost as a kid. Milton has this beautiful description of the banyan, describing it as branching so broad and long that it creates a pillared shade with echoing walks between. So here is John Muir, 65 years old, finally standing beneath that exact pillared shade. He's witnessing firsthand how those aerial roots form massive echoing walkways, fulfilling this lifelong literary and botanical fantasy. Let's head to Section 3, Divine Light in the Himalayas. Muir didn't dally long in Calcutta. In fact, by 4 p.m. that very same day, he hopped on a train bound for the mountains. He took that famous narrow-gauge toy train all the way up to the 7,000-foot elevation of Darjeeling. And when he stared out at spectacular Himalayan peaks like Kanchenjunga, which is the third highest mountain in the world, by the way, Muir experienced this profound spiritual awakening in the thin, misty mountain air. The sheer scale and majesty of those snow-capped giants just struck a massive chord within him. He was so moved by the sight that he excitedly wrote a letter back to his wife telling her that, quote, "The amber light is divine." It's such a beautiful moment because it perfectly connects his experience of this high-altitude Himalayan alpenglow back to his core lifelong philosophy. You see, to Muir, light was never just a physical thing. It represented enlightenment. It represented divine creation. He famously called his beloved Sierras the range of light, and here he was in India finding that exact same divine amber glow on the total opposite side of the planet. But of course, even while his head is in the clouds, completely distracted by divine mountain light, he is still John Muir. He meticulously cataloged the local flora. His journals are packed with detailed notes on Japanese cryptomerias, which he said immediately reminded him of California's young sequoias. He noted massive rubber trees, gorgeous Indian chestnuts with dense, glossy foliage, and the Joseph Hooker maple. That's a really unique tree with undivided leaves that doesn't look anything like a traditional maple, named after his old friend and fellow botanist. Which brings us to Section 4, Simla's Sacred Deodar Forests. So Muir takes this incredibly thrilling, fast-paced male Tonga carriage ride up to over 7,000 feet to reach the mountain town of Simla. And predictably, he was utterly bored by Simla's military artifacts and colonial architecture. His journals barely give the buildings a passing mention. But what instantly captivated him were the dense, magnificent forests of deodar trees that just blanketed the surrounding ridges, the exact kind of lush forests framing places like Gorton Castle. And man, Muir was fiercely protective of this tree. The locals apparently dismissively called the deodar a sort of fir or pine, which just deeply offended his botanical sensibilities. He was totally baffled that no one in Simla seemed to know what the tree actually was, because he knew the deodar was a highly revered true cedar, part of a really special genus related to the famous cedar of Lebanon. He always taught people that you should know a plant's true name, famously asking, "For how would you like it if people didn't call you by your name?" When it came to the deodar, his journals suddenly explode into this massive data dump. He went from barely writing a sentence about a local historic building to meticulously recording precise heights, diameters, and cone measurements for these forest giants. He's jotting down things like trunks 3 feet thick, towering heights of 125 feet, and incredibly specific observations on the flowers and the yellow pollen dusting the air. He actually spent days just wandering those forests, specifically to study the upright cones, which he measured at 2 by 3 inches and said looked just like compressed corn. But, ever the preservationist, he also recorded a pretty heartbreaking reality during these walks. He noticed that a lot of these magnificent deodar trees near the local farms were being completely stripped of their limbs just to be used for fuel. Finally, let's head into Section 5, the Banyans of Bombay. Leaving the mountains behind, Muir hopped back on the trains, traveling southward through the plains toward the coastal city of Bombay. And, as always, his meticulous eye was constantly scanning the horizon for more banyan trees. Unfortunately, he passed through an area suffering from a severe drought. He wrote this really mournful entry about how the aerial roots of the banyans there looked just pitiful. They had vainly tried to reach better ground, only to wither and die in the dry air before they could even reach the parched earth. But thankfully, once he reached urban Bombay, he witnessed a completely different, much more hopeful scene. Down there, he found these resilient giant banyans perfectly integrating with humanity. These massive trees were literally shielding old-fashioned huts and homes right beneath their sprawling canopies, living in total harmony with the bustling city surrounding them. It was just a beautiful, poetic, final botanical image for his Indian journey. On October 24th, 1903, Muir departed India and headed for Egypt. But here's the thing, he actually took the botanical spirit of the subcontinent home with him. He loved the trees of India so much that he brought back and planted several Indian deodars right at his ranch in Martinez, California, where they stood for years as towering reminders of his Himalayan awakening. So I want to leave you with this to consider. Does knowing that America's most famous naturalist held such a deep spiritual reverence for the forests of India change how we view his global legacy today? I think it just goes to show that a true love for nature recognizes absolutely no borders. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep exploring.